"Grandpa, don't go in there! Get in your car and leave! Don't tell anyone!" My 8-year-old grandson screamed. When I asked what happened, he said, "Mom and Dad are very bad." 5 minutes later, my daughter called 37 times. I already suspected why, so I put my plan into action. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Henry, and at 66 years old, I thought I knew everything about my family. I was wrong, dead wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September when I decided to surprise my daughter Amelia with an impromptu visit. She lived about 40 minutes away in one of those pristine suburban neighborhoods where every lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine. I'd been meaning to see my grandchildren more often, especially little Tommy, who was 8, and his sister Layla, who was 6. Life had been keeping me busy since my wife Martha passed 2 years ago, and I felt guilty about not being the grandfather I wanted to be. The drive over was pleasant enough. I stopped at the toy store and picked up a new puzzle for Tommy and some art supplies for Layla. Simple gifts, but I knew they'd appreciate them. I was humming along to an old Sinatra song on the radio, feeling good about my spontaneous decision to drop by. When I pulled into Amelia's driveway, everything looked normal. The house was a beautiful 2-story colonial with white shutters and a perfectly manicured front yard. Albert's black sedan was parked in the garage, and I could see Amelia's car too. Good, I thought. The whole family would be home. I grabbed the gifts from the passenger seat and walked up the stone pathway to the front door. The afternoon sun was warm on my back, and I could hear the faint sound of children playing somewhere in the neighborhood. It felt like the perfect setting for a family visit. But before I could even reach the door, it flew open. Tommy burst out, his face flushed and his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite identify at first. Fear? Panic? He ran straight to me, nearly knocking me over as he grabbed onto my legs. "Grandpa, don't go in there," he said, his voice high and urgent. "Get in your car and go away. Don't tell anyone you came here." I set down the gifts and knelt to his level, my heart immediately racing. In all my years as a father and grandfather, I'd never seen a child look so genuinely terrified. His little hands were shaking as they gripped my jacket. "Tommy, what's wrong? What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, even though alarm bells were going off in my head. He looked over his shoulder toward the house, then back at me. "Mommy and Daddy are very bad people," he whispered, as if someone might overhear him. "They told me never to tell anyone, but Grandpa, they're really, really bad." My blood ran cold. The way he said it, the tremor in his voice, the way his whole body seemed to be vibrating with nervous energy. This wasn't a child being dramatic about getting in trouble or not getting his way. This was genuine terror. "Tommy, slow down," I said, placing my hands on his small shoulders. "Can you tell Grandpa what happened? What did Mommy and Daddy do?" He shook his head frantically. "I can't tell. They said if I ever tell anyone, something really bad will happen. But Grandpa, I don't want you to go in there. Please don't go in there." That's when I noticed Layla standing in the doorway. She was partially hidden behind the frame, but I could see her little face peeking out. Even from a distance, I could tell she'd been crying. Her cheeks were red and blotchy, and she had that hollow look children get when they've been scared for too long. "Hi, sweetheart," I called to her gently. "Come say hi to Grandpa." She shook her head and disappeared back into the house. Tommy's grip on my jacket tightened. "She's scared too," he said. "We're always scared now." The words hit me like a physical blow. Always scared? What did that mean? I'd been to this house dozens of times over the years. Amelia and Albert had always seemed like loving parents. Sure, they were a bit strict, but nothing that raised any red flags. How had I missed something so serious that my own grandchildren were living in fear? I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Tommy was still clinging to me, and I could feel him trembling. I looked toward the house and saw a curtain move slightly in one of the upstairs windows. Someone was watching us. "Tommy," I said carefully, "are you and Layla hurt? Did someone hurt you?" He looked confused by the question, which somehow made it worse. "Not hurt like with hitting," he said. "But they make us do things and they say things that make my tummy feel sick all the time." Before I could ask what kind of things, I heard footsteps approaching from inside the house. Tommy's whole body went rigid. "They're coming," he whispered. "Grandpa, please just go, please." If they know I told you anything. The front door opened wider, and Albert appeared. He was smiling, but something about it seemed forced. Too bright, too wide, like he was performing rather than genuinely happy to see me. "Henry, what a surprise," he said, his voice carrying just a bit too much enthusiasm. "We weren't expecting you." "Hi, Albert," I replied, keeping my voice neutral while Tommy slowly released his grip on me and stepped back. I watched as my grandson's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The terrified, desperate child from moments before seemed to vanish, replaced by a quiet, almost robotic version of himself. "Tommy, why don't you go inside and wash up for dinner?" Albert said, still maintaining that unnaturally bright smile. "Yes, Daddy," Tommy replied in a flat, emotionless voice that sent chills down my spine. He walked past Albert into the house without looking back at me. His shoulders slumped in a way that seemed far too heavy for an 8-year-old. "Kids, you know how they are," Albert said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Always getting worked up about nothing. Come on in, Henry. Amelia will be so excited to see you." But as I looked at Albert's face, at the way his smile never wavered, at how quickly Tommy had transformed from a terrified child to a silent, obedient one, I knew with absolute certainty that my grandson hadn't been getting worked up about nothing. Something was very, very wrong in this house, and I was about to find out exactly what that something was. I didn't go inside. Every instinct I'd developed in my 66 years was screaming at me to trust Tommy's desperate warning. Instead, I looked Albert directly in the eye and said, "Actually, I just remembered I have an appointment I can't miss. Tell Amelia I stopped by." The mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. I saw something flash across Albert's face. Surprise, maybe even irritation, before that plastic smile snapped back into place. "Oh, that's too bad," he said. "She really would have loved to see you. Maybe next time you could call ahead?" The suggestion felt more like a threat than politeness. I nodded, picked up the gifts I'd dropped, and walked back to my car with measured steps. I could feel Albert's eyes boring into my back the entire time. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror and saw him still standing in the doorway, watching me leave. He stayed there until I turned the corner and disappeared from view. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. In all my years of being a father, I'd developed a pretty good sense of when something was off with children. What I'd seen in Tommy's eyes wasn't normal childhood drama or even typical rebellion. That was the look of a child who was genuinely afraid of his own parents. I pulled into a parking lot about 6 blocks away and sat there, trying to process what had just happened. My phone was on the passenger seat, and I stared at it for a long moment before making a decision. If something was really wrong, I needed to know more before I acted. Barging in without understanding the situation could make things worse for Tommy and Layla. That's when my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Amelia's name. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. Amelia again. I didn't answer, then again, and again. By the time the 5th call came through, I knew Albert had told her about my visit. But the desperation in the frequency of these calls was telling me something else entirely. This wasn't just checking in with her father. This was panic. I decided to drive to a nearby coffee shop where I could sit and think while monitoring the situation. As I ordered a black coffee and found a quiet corner table, my phone continued to buzz relentlessly. Call after call after call from Amelia. I pulled out a small notebook I always carried and started making tally marks. By the time I'd finished my coffee, she had called 37 times in less than 2 hours. 37 times. The voicemails started after the 10th call. I listened to them with growing unease. "Dad, hi, it's me. Albert said you stopped by but had to leave. That's weird. Call me back." "Dad, it's Amelia again. I'm a little confused about what happened earlier. Can you call me? It's important." "Daddy, please call me back. I need to talk to you about your visit today. There might have been some misunderstanding." The messages grew increasingly frantic as they went on. By message number 15, I could hear the strain in her voice. By message 20, she sounded genuinely panicked. "Dad, I don't know what Tommy might have said to you, but you know how kids are. They have such active imaginations. Please call me back so we can clear this up." Active imaginations. The phrase made my stomach turn because it told me everything I needed to know. Amelia knew exactly what Tommy had said to me, which meant she knew exactly what he'd witnessed or experienced, and she was already preparing to dismiss it as childhood fantasy. I sat in that coffee shop until well after dark, watching my phone buzz with call after call. Each unanswered ring was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. If everything in that house was as perfect as it appeared, why was Amelia so desperate to control the narrative of a simple family visit? Around 9 o'clock, I decided to drive back to the neighborhood, not to the house, but to a small park about 3 blocks away where I'd have a clear view of their street. I wanted to see what was happening when they thought no one was watching. I parked under some trees and waited. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree, every room blazing with light. Through the large front windows, I could see movement. Amelia was pacing back and forth in what looked like the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, her body language screamed agitation. Albert appeared in the window frame several times, and each time he did, Amelia's pacing became more frantic. They were clearly having intense discussions about something, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what that something was. But what really broke my heart was catching a glimpse of Tommy and Layla. They appeared briefly in an upstairs window, and even from my distant vantage point, I could see they were huddled together, 2 small figures pressed against each other like they were trying to disappear. That image burned itself into my memory. Those were my grandchildren, scared and alone in their own home while their parents frantically tried to manage whatever crisis my unexpected visit had created. I stayed there for over an hour, and during that time, the activity in the house never slowed down. Lights went on and off in different rooms. I saw Amelia at various windows, sometimes on the phone, sometimes just staring out into the darkness. At one point, Albert came outside and walked the perimeter of the house, as if he was checking to make sure no one was watching. He came closer to finding me than I was comfortable with, so I decided it was time to leave. But as I drove home, one thought kept running through my mind. Innocent people don't behave this way. Parents who have nothing to hide don't make 37 panicked phone calls because their father stopped by for an unexpected visit. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table and really looked at my phone for the first time in hours. The call log was staggering. Amelia had called 43 times total. There were also 7 text messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Dad, please call me. I'm really worried about you. Are you okay? Tommy told me he said some silly things to you. Kids say the strangest stuff sometimes. Dad, I'm coming over if you don't answer me soon. Please don't be mad at us. Whatever you think happened, I can explain. I love you, Daddy. Please just talk to me. I'm scared you're going to misunderstand everything." That last message hit me like a punch to the gut. She was scared I was going to misunderstand. Misunderstand what exactly? The only way someone could misunderstand a situation is if there was actually something to misunderstand in the first place. I turned off my phone and went to bed, but sleep was impossible. I kept seeing Tommy's terrified face, hearing his desperate whisper, "They're very bad people, Grandpa." I kept replaying the way Layla had hidden behind the door frame, too scared to even say hello to her grandfather. And I kept thinking about how quickly Tommy had changed when Albert appeared, like a switch had been flipped, like he'd been trained to hide his real feelings the moment his parents were around. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't ignore what I'd seen, and I couldn't let Amelia's flood of phone calls distract me from the truth Tommy had tried so desperately to tell me. My grandchildren were in trouble, and I was the only one who knew it. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of calling Amelia back or pretending nothing had happened, I decided to do something I'd never done before in my life. I was going to spy on my own family. I know how that sounds. A 66-year-old man lurking around his daughter's neighborhood like some kind of stalker. But Tommy's terror had been real, and those 43 phone calls weren't the reaction of innocent parents. Something was happening in that house, and I was going to find out what. I drove back to the neighborhood around 7 in the morning, parking on a side street where I could see their house but remain hidden behind a row of hedges. I brought my binoculars, the ones I used for bird watching, and settled in to wait. What I saw over the next 3 hours shattered everything I thought I knew about my daughter's family. At 7:15, Albert left for work. Normal enough. But about 10 minutes after his car disappeared down the street, I saw movement in the backyard. Amelia had come outside with Tommy and Layla, and even from my distant position, I could tell something was very wrong with the scene. The children were standing perfectly still, like little soldiers at attention. Amelia was pacing back and forth in front of them, and though I couldn't hear what she was saying, her body language was aggressive, angry. She kept pointing at them, and with each gesture, I could see both kids flinch. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. Amelia grabbed Tommy by the shoulders and shook him, hard. The little boy's head snapped back and forth, but he didn't cry out. He didn't even react. He just stood there and took it, like he was used to it. I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from jumping out of the car right then and there. After shaking Tommy, Amelia knelt down to his level and appeared to be speaking directly into his face. Whatever she was saying, it was making him nod frantically. When she finished, she stood up and walked back toward the house, leaving both children standing in the yard. That's when I witnessed something that broke my heart completely. The moment Amelia was out of sight, both children collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally. Tommy sank to his knees and started crying, not the loud, dramatic crying of a normal child, but silent, body-shaking sobs. Layla rushed to him and wrapped her tiny arms around his shoulders, and they clung to each other like they were drowning. They stayed like that for several minutes, just holding each other and crying in complete silence. Two babies comforting each other because they had no one else. I was reaching for my car door handle when Amelia reappeared. Instantly, both children jumped apart and stood up straight again. The crying stopped. The comfort stopped. They became those perfect little statues again, and Amelia herded them back into the house. I sat there for another hour, trying to process what I'd witnessed. This wasn't typical parental discipline. This wasn't even harsh but well-meaning parenting. This was something much darker. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to take a risk. I drove to the local elementary school and asked to speak with the principal. I'd volunteered there a few times over the years, so Mrs. Patterson knew me as Tommy's grandfather. "I'm a bit concerned about my grandson," I told her, trying to sound casual. "Has he seemed different lately? Any changes in his behavior or demeanor?" Mrs. Patterson's expression immediately grew serious. She invited me into her office and closed the door. "Mr. Henderson, I'm actually glad you asked," she said. "Tommy has shown some concerning changes this school year. He's become very withdrawn, very anxious. He used to be one of our more outgoing students, but now he barely speaks unless spoken to directly." My heart sank. "Has he said anything about what might be causing this?" "That's just it," she said, lowering her voice. "When we've tried to talk to him about it, he gets extremely upset, almost panicked. He keeps saying he can't talk about home, that he's not allowed to tell anyone anything about his family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not allowed to tell anyone about his family. That wasn't normal childhood privacy. That was enforced silence. "Has the school contacted his parents about this?" I asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "We've reached out to Mrs. Morrison several times. She's always very cooperative and concerned sounding on the phone, but nothing seems to change with Tommy. If anything, he seems more anxious after we've spoken with her." I thanked Mrs. Patterson and left the school with my worst fears confirmed. Whatever was happening at home was serious enough that Tommy was carrying the effects into every part of his life. But I still needed more information before I could act. So I made another decision that went against every instinct I had as a polite, non-confrontational person. I was going to figure out a way to get those children alone and find out exactly what they were being put through. That afternoon, I positioned myself at the park near their house and waited. Around 3:30, I saw Amelia's car pull into the driveway. She got out alone. Apparently she'd picked the kids up from school herself, rather than letting them walk or take the bus. I watched through my binoculars as she ushered Tommy and Layla into the house. But about 20 minutes later, Tommy appeared in the backyard by himself. He was just standing there, staring at nothing, with that same hollow expression I'd seen that morning. This was my chance. I walked casually through the neighborhood, timing it so I'd pass by their backyard fence just as Tommy was there. When I called his name softly, he looked up and saw me through the chain link. His face immediately filled with terror. He looked toward the house, then back at me, his eyes wide with panic. "Tommy, it's okay," I whispered. "Grandpa just wants to make sure you're safe." He approached the fence slowly, like a scared animal. When he got close enough, I could see that his little face was puffy and red, like he'd been crying recently. "Grandpa, you can't be here," he whispered. "If Mommy sees you, she'll be really, really mad. Tommy, I need you to tell me the truth. Are Mommy and Daddy hurting you?" He shook his head frantically. "They don't hit us, but Grandpa," his voice broke. "They make us practice." "Practice what, sweetheart?" "Practice being happy. Practice saying the right things. Practice acting like we love them when other people are around." His words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them in for so long they couldn't wait to escape. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "What happens if you don't practice right?" Tommy's whole body started shaking. "They take away everything. No food, no toys, no talking to each other. And they tell us that if we ever tell anyone the truth, they'll make Layla go away forever. And it will be my fault." The piece of the puzzle that had been missing suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't just neglect or even abuse in the traditional sense. This was systematic psychological manipulation. Amelia and Albert were training their children to be perfect little actors, to perform happiness and love for the outside world while living in constant fear at home. "Tommy, listen to me very carefully," I said, keeping my voice calm even though I was shaking with rage. "You and Layla are not going to have to practice anymore. Grandpa is going to make sure of that." He looked at me with hope and terror warring in his 8-year-old eyes. "You promise, Grandpa? You promise they can't make us pretend anymore?" "I promise, sweetheart. But I need you to do something for me. Can you be brave for just a little while longer, while Grandpa figures out how to help you?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. As I walked away from that fence, I knew my life had just changed completely. I wasn't just Henry Henderson, retired insurance salesman, anymore. I was now a man on a mission to save his grandchildren from something far worse than I could have ever imagined. And I was going to make sure Amelia and Albert never got the chance to hurt those babies again. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, mapping out everything I knew and everything I needed to do. At 66 years old, I'd never imagined I'd be planning what essentially amounted to a rescue mission for my own grandchildren, but that's exactly what this had become. The first thing I did was write down everything Tommy had told me, word for word, while it was still fresh in my memory. Practice being happy, practice saying the right things, practice acting like we love them when other people are around. The words made me physically sick to write, but I knew I'd need every detail if this was going to work. I'd spent 38 years in the insurance business, which meant I'd learned a thing or two about documentation and building a case. If I was going to protect Tommy and Layla, I couldn't just rely on the word of an 8-year-old boy. I needed evidence, and I needed a plan that would keep the children safe while I gathered it. The next morning, I made my first call to my lawyer, David Chen. I'd known David for 15 years. He'd handled Martha's estate and various other legal matters for me over the years. He was also one of the few people I trusted completely. "David, I need your help with something, and I need you to keep this strictly confidential for now," I told him. "Of course, Henry. What's going on?" I gave him the basic outline of what I'd discovered, leaving out some of the more emotional details but hitting all the key points. There was a long silence when I finished. "Henry, these are very serious allegations," David said finally. "If what you're telling me is true, we're talking about psychological abuse and manipulation of minors. But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If we move too fast or make the wrong move, it could make things worse for the children." "That's exactly what I was afraid of," I said. "What do you recommend?" "First, we need to document everything. Every interaction, every observation, every conversation. Second, we need to establish a pattern of behavior, not just isolated incidents. And third, we need to make sure we have alternative living arrangements ready before we make any official moves." David walked me through the legal process for filing for emergency custody. It was more complicated than I'd hoped, but not impossible. The key would be proving that the children were in immediate psychological danger. "The good news is that as their grandfather, you'd be given serious consideration for custody if we can prove the parents are unfit," David explained. "The bad news is that psychological abuse is harder to prove than physical abuse. We'll need to be very thorough." After I hung up with David, I made my second important call. My neighbor, Carol Winters, had been a social worker for 30 years before retiring. If anyone would know how to handle this situation properly, it would be her. "Carol, I need to ask you something in confidence," I said when she answered. "If you suspected a child was being psychologically abused, what would be the best way to help them?" I could hear the concern in her voice immediately. "Henry, is everything okay?" I gave her a general overview of the situation. Carol listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Henry, what you're describing sounds like a form of emotional abuse called coercive control," she said. "It's when someone uses psychological tactics to control and manipulate others, especially children. It's very serious, and it can cause lasting psychological damage. What's the best way to help the children?" "The most important thing is to make sure they know they have a safe person they can turn to. Children in these situations often feel completely alone and helpless. They need to know that someone sees what's happening and that someone is going to help them." Carol agreed to help me document what I'd observed and to be available as a professional witness if needed. She also gave me some guidance on how to interact with Tommy and Layla in ways that would help them feel safe without putting them in more danger. "Don't ask them to tell you things they're afraid to tell," she advised. "Instead, let them know that you see them, you love them, and you're working on ways to help them. That knowledge alone can be incredibly powerful for a child who feels trapped. Over the next week, I established a routine. Every day I found a reason to be in the neighborhood. Sometimes I'd park at the coffee shop 3 blocks away and walk past their house. Sometimes I'd sit in the park and watch from a distance. I was careful never to be obvious about it, but I wanted to observe the family's patterns and behaviors. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The children were like completely different people depending on whether their parents were watching. When Amelia or Albert were present, Tommy and Layla were perfect little angels, quiet, obedient, almost eerily well-behaved. But in the brief moments when they thought no one was looking, they became what they really were: scared, sad children who clung to each other for comfort. I also started noticing things I'd missed before. The way Amelia's voice changed when she talked to the children versus when she talked to other adults. The way Albert positioned himself to block other people's view of the children during conversations. The way both kids immediately looked to their parents for approval before answering even simple questions like, "How was school today?" But the most heartbreaking thing I observed was during a neighborhood barbecue at the house next door. I'd positioned myself where I could see into the backyard, and I watched as Tommy and Layla performed for the neighbors. They smiled on cue, laughed at the right moments, and played the role of happy children perfectly. But when the neighbors weren't looking directly at them, their faces would go completely blank, like actors dropping their masks between scenes. After 2 weeks of observation, I had enough evidence to make me sick to my stomach, but I still needed more before I could act. That's when I decided to take a bigger risk. I started showing up at places where I knew the family would be: the grocery store, the library, the children's school events. I wanted to establish myself as a regular presence in their lives again. But more importantly, I wanted Tommy and Layla to see me and know that Grandpa was watching over them. The first time I appeared at Tommy's soccer game, Amelia looked like she'd seen a ghost. She came over to me with that forced smile I was beginning to recognize. "Dad, what a surprise. I didn't know you were coming to Tommy's game." "Well, I am his grandfather," I said pleasantly. "I want to support him." I could see the wheels turning in her head. She couldn't object to my presence without looking bad in front of the other parents, but she clearly didn't want me there. "Of course," she said. "It's just that you usually let us know when you're planning to come to things." "I'll try to remember that," I said, settling into my lawn chair and making it clear I wasn't going anywhere. During the game, I watched Amelia like a hawk. Every time Tommy made a mistake, missing a pass or being in the wrong position, I saw her face tighten with anger. But when other parents were looking, she was all smiles and encouragement. "Great try, sweetie," she'd call out in a voice that sounded supportive but had an edge to it that made my skin crawl. After the game, Tommy ran over to me, and for just a moment, his face lit up with genuine happiness. But then he glanced at his mother, and that light immediately dimmed. "Hi, Grandpa," he said quietly. "I didn't know you were coming." "I wanted to see you play," I told him. "You did great out there." Before Tommy could respond, Amelia was beside us. "Say thank you to Grandpa, Tommy, and then we need to get going." "Thank you, Grandpa," Tommy said obediently, but his eyes were trying to tell me something else entirely. As they walked away, I heard Amelia say to Albert, "We need to talk when we get home." I knew that conversation wasn't going to be pleasant for anyone, especially not for Tommy. But I also knew that my plan was working. My presence was making them nervous, making them feel like they were being watched. Good. They should feel nervous. Because I was watching and I was getting closer to having everything I needed to get those children away from them permanently. 3 weeks into my investigation, I knew I had enough evidence to raise serious concerns, but I needed something more concrete. Something that would force Amelia and Albert to show their true selves in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. That's when I came up with a plan that would either give me everything I needed or potentially put me in serious trouble with my own family. I was going to create a situation where they couldn't maintain their perfect parent facade. The opportunity came when I overheard Amelia talking to another mother at the grocery store about how stressed she was planning Tommy's upcoming 9th birthday party. She was going on and on about wanting everything to be perfect, about how important it was for Tommy to have wonderful memories of his childhood. The irony made me want to scream, but it also gave me an idea. That evening, I called Amelia. For the first time in weeks, I was the one initiating contact. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. I was thinking about Tommy's birthday, and I'd love to help with the party. Maybe I could host it at my house. I have that big backyard, and I know how much the kids love the swing set Martha and I put in. There was a long pause. I could practically hear her calculating the pros and cons of this offer. "Oh, Dad, that's so sweet of you," she said finally, but her voice was tight. "But we've already made arrangements. The party is going to be at our house." "Well, then let me help with the planning. I could handle the decorations or maybe organize some games for the kids. It would mean so much to me to be involved." Another pause. "Let me talk to Albert and get back to you." I knew she'd agree. They couldn't refuse their children's grandfather's offer to help without raising questions, especially since I'd been making myself such a visible presence in their lives lately. But I also knew they'd want to control every aspect of my involvement. Sure enough, she called back the next day with a list of very specific tasks I could handle. I could bring balloons. I could help set up tables and chairs. I could even handle the photography, since I'd always been good with my camera. But I was not to plan any activities, not to interact with the other parents unsupervised, and definitely not to give Tommy his gift in front of the other children. That last restriction told me everything I needed to know. They were afraid of what I might say or do if I had Tommy's attention while other people were watching. The party was set for the following Saturday afternoon. I spent the week preparing, but not in the way Amelia expected. I arranged for Carol Winters to be, coincidentally, walking her dog past the house during the party. I made sure David Chen knew exactly when and where this was happening, in case something went wrong and I needed legal backup quickly. And I prepared a gift for Tommy that I knew would create exactly the reaction I was hoping for. Saturday arrived gray and chilly, but dry enough for an outdoor party. I showed up an hour early, as requested, with my car full of balloons and my professional quality camera around my neck. Amelia and Albert were already in full performance mode, bustling around the backyard, arranging everything to look perfect. "Dad, thank you so much for helping," Amelia said, giving me a hug that felt completely artificial. "The kids are so excited that Grandpa is going to be here for the whole party." But when I looked around, I didn't see any excited children. Tommy was sitting on the back steps, dressed in new clothes that looked uncomfortable, staring at his hands. Layla was beside him, wearing a frilly dress that seemed more suited for a wedding than a child's birthday party. Neither of them looked happy or excited. They looked like they were preparing for an ordeal. "Hi, birthday boy," I said, walking over to Tommy. "How does it feel to be 9 years old?" He looked up at me, and for just a moment I saw a flash of real emotion in his eyes, relief, maybe even hope. But then Amelia was there. "Tommy, what do you say to Grandpa?" she prompted. "Thank you for coming to my party, Grandpa," he said in that flat, rehearsed voice that made my heart ache. As the other families began arriving, I watched Amelia and Albert transform into the perfect hosts. They greeted each family with enthusiasm, complimented the children on their clothes, made sure everyone felt welcome. And they orchestrated Tommy and Layla like directors positioning actors on a stage. "Tommy, honey, why don't you show the Johnson boys your new bike?" Amelia would suggest, and Tommy would obediently lead the other children to the garage. "Layla, sweetheart, Mrs. Martinez was asking about your art project from school. Why don't you tell her about it?" And Layla would recite what sounded like a memorized description of her artwork. I took photos throughout the afternoon, but I wasn't just capturing the party. I was documenting the performance, the way Tommy's smile never reached his eyes, the way Layla kept glancing at her parents for approval before speaking, the way both children became more animated when other adults paid attention to them, as if they were starved for genuine interaction. But I was also watching Amelia and Albert, waiting for the moment when their masks would slip. That moment came when it was time for Tommy to open his presents. All the children had gathered in a circle on the grass, and the pile of wrapped gifts sat in the center. Tommy was directed to sit at the front, with Amelia and Albert flanking him like bodyguards. I positioned myself where I could see everything clearly and started taking pictures. Tommy opened each gift with polite enthusiasm, thanking each child and their parents appropriately. But I could see the strain on his face. This wasn't a child enjoying his birthday presents. This was a child performing the role of grateful birthday boy. Then he got to my gift. I'd wrapped it carefully in bright blue paper, Tommy's favorite color, though I doubted his parents remembered that detail. When he tore off the wrapping, he revealed a simple wooden box with his name carved into the lid. Tommy's face lit up with the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all day. "Grandpa, did you make this?" "I did," I said. "Open it up." Inside the box was a collection of things I'd saved from Tommy's early childhood. Photos of him as a baby with Martha and me. A little toy car he'd played with during visits to our house. A drawing he'd made for us when he was 4 years old. And at the bottom, a letter I'd written to him about how proud I was to be his grandfather and how much I loved him. For a moment, Tommy forgot where he was. He pulled out each item with wonder, examining the photos, holding the little car like it was made of gold. When he found the letter, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Grandpa, this is the best present ever," he said, and his voice was completely natural for the first time all day. That's when Amelia snapped. "Tommy, that's enough," she said sharply. "You have other presents to open." But Tommy didn't hear her. He was too absorbed in reading the letter, his lips moving silently as he worked through the words. "Tommy," Albert said, his voice carrying a warning that made several of the other parents look up. Tommy finally looked up from the letter, and I saw something beautiful happen. For just a moment, he wasn't the scared, obedient child they'd trained him to be. He was a 9-year-old boy who just received something that meant the world to him. "Mom, Dad, look what Grandpa made for me," he said, holding up the box. "He saved all this stuff from when I was little." "That's very nice, sweetheart," Amelia said through gritted teeth. "But we need to finish opening presents so we can have cake." "But Mom, look at this picture," Tommy insisted, showing her a photo of him sitting on Martha's lap. "That's great-grandma Martha. Grandpa says she loved me very much." I watched Amelia's face carefully, and I saw the exact moment when her control started to crack. Her smile became strained, her jaw tightened, and her eyes flashed with something that looked dangerously close to rage. "Tommy, put that away right now," she said, and this time her voice was sharp enough that several of the other children stopped what they were doing to stare. "But Mom," I said, "put it away." Amelia's voice cracked like a whip, and suddenly the entire party went silent. Tommy flinched as if he'd been slapped. The joy drained from his face instantly, replaced by that familiar look of fear. He quickly shoved everything back into the box and closed the lid, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he whispered. The other parents were staring now, clearly uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Martinez looked particularly concerned, glancing between Tommy's terrified face and Amelia's angry one. Albert jumped in quickly, trying to salvage the situation. "Sorry about that, everyone. Birthday parties can be overwhelming for kids sometimes. Tommy, why don't you open your present from the Johnsons next?" But the damage was done. I had captured the whole thing on camera, and more importantly, 8 other families had witnessed Amelia losing control over something as innocent as a child being excited about a gift from his grandfather. As Tommy mechanically opened the remaining presents, I noticed several of the parents whispering to each other. Mrs. Martinez kept watching Tommy with concern. Mr. Johnson looked deeply uncomfortable. When the party ended an hour later, I lingered while the other families said their goodbyes. I wanted to hear what they said to Amelia and Albert, and more importantly, I wanted to see how my daughter and son-in-law behaved once they thought the performance was over. I didn't have to wait long. The moment the last guest left and we were alone in the backyard, Amelia turned on Tommy with a fury that took my breath away. "What did I tell you about showing off in front of company?" she hissed, grabbing the wooden box from his hands. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone." "Amelia, he's just a child," I started to say, but Albert cut me off. "Henry, I think you should go," he said coldly. "The kids are tired, and we need to clean up." But I wasn't going anywhere. Not when I'd finally seen behind their mask, and definitely not when Tommy was looking at me with desperate eyes, silently begging me not to leave him alone with them. "Actually," I said, "I think we all need to have a conversation." The backyard felt like a battlefield. The remnants of Tommy's birthday party, scattered wrapping paper, deflated balloons, cake crumbs on paper plates, created an eerily festive backdrop for what was about to become the most important confrontation of my life. "We need to have a conversation," I repeated, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Amelia was still gripping Tommy's wooden box, her knuckles white with anger. Albert had positioned himself between me and the children, as if he were protecting them from me instead of the other way around. "Dad, not now," Amelia said, but I could hear the panic creeping into her voice. "The kids need to go inside and rest." "No," I said firmly. "The kids need to hear this." Tommy and Layla were huddled together near the back steps, watching the adult drama unfold with the kind of terrified attention that children develop when they've learned to read danger in every conversation. "Henry, you're overstepping," Albert said, his voice carrying that same threatening undertone I'd heard before. "These are our children, and we'll handle them however we see fit." "Handle them?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Is that what you call what you've been doing to them?" Amelia's face went pale. "I don't know what you think you've seen, but I've seen enough." I cut her off. "I've seen you training them to perform happiness. I've seen them crying in silence when they think no one is watching. I've seen them flinch when you raise your voice. And I just watched you punish a 9-year-old boy for being excited about a gift from his grandfather." The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy had started crying again, those silent, heartbreaking tears that no child should ever have to shed. "You don't understand," Amelia said, but her voice had lost its authority. "You don't know how hard it is to raise children these days. They need structure. They need discipline. They need love," I said. "Real love, not performance-based affection that disappears the moment they step out of line." Albert stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You have no right to come into our home and tell us how to raise our children. You barely visited before Martha died, and now suddenly you're the expert on parenting." The accusation stung because there was some truth to it, but I wasn't going to let guilt distract me from what needed to happen. "You're right," I said. "I should have been more involved before now. I should have seen what was happening sooner. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere until these children are safe." "Safe?" Amelia laughed, but it was a bitter, desperate sound. "Safe from what?" "We provide for them. We make sure they have everything they need. You terrorize them," I said quietly. "You've turned your own children into actors in a play where the only acceptable emotion is obedience." Behind Albert, I could see Tommy trying to comfort Layla, who had started shaking. Even in the middle of this crisis, that little boy was more concerned about his sister's well-being than his own safety. That's when I pulled out my phone and played the recording I'd made of my conversation with Tommy at the fence 3 weeks earlier. Practice being happy. Practice saying the right things. Practice acting like we love them when other people are around. Tommy's small, terrified voice filled the backyard, and I watched as both Amelia and Albert realized that their carefully constructed world was crumbling around them. "You recorded him?" Amelia whispered, her face ashen. "You recorded our son without our permission." "I documented a child asking for help," I corrected, "and I have 3 weeks' worth of observations, photographs, and witness statements that back up everything he told me." Albert lunged toward me, but I stepped back calmly. "I wouldn't, if I were you. Not with the children watching, and not when Carol Winters has been recording this entire conversation from her position at the fence." Both Amelia and Albert spun around to see Carol standing just beyond their property line, her phone clearly visible in her hands. As a retired social worker, her testimony would carry significant weight in any legal proceeding. "You set us up," Albert said, his voice filled with disbelief. "I created an opportunity for you to show your true selves," I replied, "and you didn't disappoint." Amelia sank into one of the party chairs, the wooden box still clutched in her hands. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she looked like what she really was. A broken woman who had been taking her pain out on innocent children. "We never meant to hurt them," she whispered. "But you did hurt them," I said gently. "Every day, in ways that might take years to heal. The question now is whether you're going to let me help them, or whether we're going to have to do this the hard way." The conversation that followed was painful and necessary. I laid out exactly what was going to happen. Tommy and Layla were coming home with me, immediately and permanently. David Chen already had the emergency custody papers filed, and Carol's documentation as a mandated reporter would ensure they were processed quickly. Amelia and Albert could fight it if they wanted to, but given the evidence I'd collected and the witnesses I'd assembled, they wouldn't win. More importantly, any attempt to fight would only drag the children through more trauma. "There are children," Amelia said, but her voice was hollow. "No," I said firmly. "You gave up the right to call them that when you decided to treat them as objects instead of human beings." When it came time for Tommy and Layla to pack their things, I was amazed by how little they wanted to take with them. A few clothes, some books, and the wooden box I'd given Tommy. That was it. Everything else in that beautiful house held no sentimental value for them because it was all part of the performance. As we loaded their small bags into my car, Tommy looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too old for his 9 years. "Grandpa, are we really not coming back?" "Not unless you want to," I told him, "and only if it's ever safe for you to want to." Layla slipped her small hand into mine. "Will we have to practice being happy at your house?" The question broke my heart all over again. "Sweetheart, at Grandpa's house, you never have to pretend to feel anything you don't really feel. If you're sad, you can be sad. If you're scared, you can tell me. If you're happy, it will be real happiness, not something you have to perform." 6 months later, I was sitting in my backyard watching Tommy and Layla play on the swing set that Martha and I had installed years ago for visits that had never happened often enough. They were laughing, really laughing, not the careful, measured laughter they'd been trained to perform. Tommy had started speaking up in school again. His teacher told me that he'd raised his hand in class last week to disagree with something she'd said, respectfully but confidently. For most parents, that might be concerning. For me, it was a miracle. It meant he was learning that his own thoughts and opinions had value. Layla had started drawing pictures of our house, always with all three of us in the front yard, always with huge smiles on our faces. But more importantly, she'd started drawing pictures of dragons and monsters and imaginary worlds, which meant her creativity was finally free to flourish. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Amelia and Albert were required to undergo extensive counseling before they could even request supervised visitation. And honestly, I wasn't sure they ever would. The last I'd heard, they were getting divorced, each blaming the other for the loss of their children. I felt sorry for them, in a way. They'd been so focused on creating the appearance of a perfect family that they'd forgotten how to actually be one. But my sympathy had limits. The children they damaged were my priority now. That evening, as I was tucking Tommy into bed, he asked me a question that let me know we were finally moving in the right direction. "Grandpa, do you think I could learn to play baseball? Real baseball? Not just for show." "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea," I told him. "We can sign you up for the community league if you want, even if I'm not very good at it." "Especially if you're not very good at it," I said. "That's how you get better, by trying things and making mistakes and learning from them." He was quiet for a moment, processing this revolutionary concept. At Mom and Dad's house, we weren't allowed to make mistakes. Well, at Grandpa's house, mistakes are how we learn. And the only thing you're not allowed to do is pretend to be something you're not. Tommy smiled, one of his real smiles that had become more frequent over the past few months. I like Grandpa's rules better. As I turned off his light and headed downstairs, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that September afternoon, when Tommy had begged me not to go into his house. I'd lost a daughter in a way, but I'd gained something infinitely more precious: the chance to give two beautiful children the childhood they deserved. My phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent for once. No more desperate calls from Amelia, no more attempts at manipulation or guilt. Just peace. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out onto the back porch. The swing set creaked gently in the evening breeze, and I could hear the faint sound of Layla singing herself to sleep upstairs. These were the sounds of a real home, filled with real love and real security. At 66 years old, I'd thought my days of active parenting were behind me. I'd been wrong about that, just like I'd been wrong about so many things. But sometimes being wrong leads you exactly where you need to be. Tomorrow, Tommy had his first baseball practice, and Layla was starting art classes at the community center. We were building a life together, not a performance, not a facade, but a real life where two precious children could finally learn what it felt like to be genuinely loved and accepted for exactly who they were. And that was worth everything I'd had to sacrifice to make it happen.